The chandeliers of the Harrington Winter Ball glowed like suspended constellations, their candlelight trembling against the polished marble floors as though the very air quivered with anticipation. Carriages had arrived in a glittering procession, delivering young debutantes wrapped in silks and excitement, their mothers sharp-eyed and ambitious, their fathers resigned to the rituals of the season. And among them, moving with a grace that time had never stripped away, was Miss Margaret Ellington, a gentlewoman of 40 years whose dignity had become her sole armor in a world that adored youth and dismissed everything else. She stepped into the ballroom quietly, her dove-gray gown offering no competition to the flaming hues and jeweled brilliance worn by women half her age. She had never been one to demand the room's attention. Tonight, however, the room felt almost determined to deny her even the smallest courtesy of invisibility. A pair of young ladies lingered near the refreshment table, whispering as Margaret passed. Their fans fluttered like nervous birds, but their voices were bold and careless. "There she is," one murmured, "the eternal chaperone. I heard she is here only because Lady Ashbury insists someone respectable must be available to instruct us in decorum." The other giggled. "Decorum or the art of vanishing? She has mastered both." Their laughter pricked her like stray needles. Margaret continued onward, eyes steady, chin unbowed, though she felt the sting settle into her ribs with familiar weight. Shame was not new to her. She had learned to inhale it like cold air and exhale something resembling composure. Tonight, however, the whispers multiplied. Mothers nodded at her with pity disguised as politeness. Men offered brief, absent glances before returning to the glittering girls they believed worth courting. Someone remarked that Margaret ought to retire from the season entirely, as if womanhood expired like fruit when the bloom of youth faded. The remark was not meant for her ears, but the walls of ballrooms carried gossip like wind carried smoke, everywhere and always toward her. She found refuge near the grand staircase, where she could observe without being observed too closely. The orchestra swelled, couples glided, silk rustled like restless waves. Margaret felt neither bitterness nor longing, only a soft ache that had once been longing but had long since cooled. She had accepted her place in society's great tapestry, a stitch barely noticed yet expected to hold without complaint. And then, as though fate grew impatient with her quiet acceptance, he arrived. The Duke of Harrowden entered the ballroom with the effortless authority of a man who had seen battlefields of diplomacy and found court gossip comparatively trivial. Thomas Blackwood, 36, newly returned from years abroad, was the subject of every matchmaking mother's fantasy and every young lady's fluttering heartbeat. Tall, reserved, almost austere in his dark evening coat, he seemed carved from some rarer element of the world, something steadier, something older than fashion. The room shifted subtly around him, conversations pausing as if he had drawn the very breath from the air. Margaret did not notice him at first. She was accustomed to watching the world, not starring in its gaze. But when she did lift her eyes, she found him looking directly at her. Not with curiosity, nor mockery, nor idle interest. His expression held the quiet focus of a man seeing something unexpected, something worth seeing again. The moment was brief, scarcely more than a heartbeat, yet it unsettled something deep within her, like dust rising from a long untouched shelf. She looked away quickly, refusing to invent stories around a single glance. Men like him did not look twice at women like her. She had spent too many years learning that truth to forget it because of candlelight and wishful thinking. Still, the room had noticed. "Why would a duke look at her?" whispered a young gentleman to his companion. "Perhaps he mistakes her for someone else," the companion replied. "Or perhaps pity extends even to dukes." Laughter followed, crisp and cruel. Margaret felt heat creep up her neck. She turned toward a window, pretending interest in the snow beginning to fall beyond the glass. The cold world outside seemed kinder than the glittering one within. A few minutes later, as she attempted to slip quietly toward the retiring room to regain her composure, a debutante with bright ribbons and brighter vanity intercepted her. "Miss Ellington," the girl said sweetly, "would you mind terribly standing near us for the next quadrille? Mamma says your presence lends us an air of propriety." She paused, then added without malice but with devastating innocence, "Older ladies are such a comfort." Margaret smiled, the practiced, polite curve of lips that hid more than it revealed, and agreed. Declining would cause a scene, accepting only deepened her humiliation. Yet what choice did she have? She had spent 20 seasons learning how to navigate these moments without revealing the bruises beneath her calm. As she took her place beside the young ladies, their chatter rising like birdsong, Margaret glanced once more across the ballroom. The Duke had been drawn into conversation by the ambitious Lady Harroway, but his eyes drifted again, toward her, unmistakably, undeniably. For the first time in years, Margaret's breath caught. Not from hope, but from fear of hope. This too was noticed. "Look," hissed someone behind her. "He glances at her again. How strange." "Not strange," another corrected. "Suspicious. Perhaps she means to attach herself to him." Women her age grow desperate. The words dripped like poison into the air. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself. She had survived far worse. Broken promises, faded futures, loneliness masquerading as independence. Yet tonight, for reasons she could not name, the cruelty felt sharper. Perhaps because the Duke's gaze had introduced a possibility she dared not entertain, that she was still visible. As the quadrille began, she stood silent, hands folded neatly, every breath measured. The orchestra swirled around her, strings lamenting softly beneath the lively beat. She watched the dancers but felt detached from them, as though viewing life through a pane of glass. Then the final blow came, a whisper carried directly to her ear by someone who had not meant to be overheard. "Why would a duke look at a woman who has already had her life?" The word struck with such precision she felt her composure fracture. She turned slightly, just enough to glimpse the duke once more, and found him watching her with an expression she could not decipher. Concern, perhaps, or curiosity sharpened by the cruelty he had clearly overheard. That look, lingering longer than society deemed proper, was the moment the night shifted. The room continued to dance, laugh, sparkle. But Margaret felt something deepen in the space between herself and the Duke, something invisible yet undeniable, something that would not easily be forgotten. And though she turned away, pretending indifference, the truth pressed against her ribs with startling clarity. The most desired man in the ballroom had noticed her, and the world, already poised to mock her, was about to sharpen its claws. Morning light filtered through the tall windows of Langford House as though cautious of disturbing the quiet gathering taking place within. The abolitionist reading was not a grand affair. It was the sort of earnest assembly that attracted scholars, reformers, and the occasional noble searching for a reputation burnished by philanthropy. Miss Margaret Ellington found comfort in such circles. Here, the air did not vibrate with gossip or ambition but with purpose, and the voices rose not in ridicule but in thoughtful debate. She took her seat near the back, folding her gloves neatly into her lap, praying for an hour of peace untainted by society's relentless scrutiny. Yet even in this serene setting, two ladies at the front cast glances toward her, murmuring of last night's ball. The wound was fresh and the gossip, predictably, had not slept. Still, as the speaker began to read from a pamphlet on the emancipation of enslaved children in the West Indies, Margaret steadied herself. Her heart, so often shaped by disappointment, had always responded to the call of justice. She listened intently, her expression softening as the words pressed against her conscience. When the speaker invited comments, the room fell into a hesitant silence. Scholars shifted, gentlemen stroked their chins, but no one rose. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. She had spoken at such gatherings before, though timidly, always fearing that even here, her voice might be dismissed. She rose anyway. Her voice, though gentle, carried with a clarity that filled the room. She spoke of moral duty, of Britain's evolving conscience, of how true progress demanded courage rather than convenience. She quoted historical precedents, referenced debates in Parliament, and framed each point with a compassion that softened even the more rigid listeners. Only when she had finished did she notice the figure near the doorway. The Duke of Harrowden stood with one gloved hand resting lightly against the arch, his posture relaxed but his gaze sharpened with unmistakable interest. He had slipped in quietly, yet it seemed the entire room had shifted around his presence. Margaret's breath faltered, though only for a moment. She lowered herself back into her chair, cheeks warmed by the echo of her own boldness. When the gathering concluded, conversation swelled, and the Duke crossed the room with unhurried precision. Several gentlemen stepped aside instinctively. He possessed the kind of authority one did not impede. Margaret felt a familiar urge to retreat, but she forced herself to remain still. His shadow fell across her before his voice did. "Miss Ellington," he said, his tone measured, "your remarks were the most lucid I have heard on the matter. I find myself wishing I had returned to England sooner, if only to hear you speak before today." His words were neither flattery nor politeness. They were startlingly sincere. Margaret could not immediately respond. She managed a modest inclination of her head, though the world felt suddenly too bright. "You honor me, your grace," she replied softly. "I fear I merely speak what I believe." "Precisely," he murmured. "Most speak what they think others wish to hear." A quiet pause hung between them, rich with unspoken meanings. The Duke's gaze was calm, yet attentive, as though searching not for her beauty, which society claimed she lacked, but for the mind and soul that shaped her words. It unsettled her more deeply than any insult. Their conversation lasted only a moment longer. Simple courtesies, gentle inquiries, an offer to share certain parliamentary documents he possessed. Nothing scandalous, nothing overt. And yet the significance of that brief exchange rippled far beyond the walls of Langford House. By evening, London had already twisted the tale. Margaret arrived at Lady Ferncroft's soiree hoping to disappear into the crowd, but whispers clung to her like burrs. "I heard she cornered him after the reading," said one woman. "A shrewd move for someone her age," remarked another. A gentleman laughed, adding, "If she traps the Duke, it will prove desperation has no limit." Margaret kept her gaze fixed forward, praying her expression betrayed nothing of the humiliation clawing at her insides. But then the room shifted, not unlike the way air shifts when a storm approaches. The Duke of Harrowden entered, and the atmosphere rearranged itself entirely. He scanned the room once, briefly, before striding directly toward her. Conversations faltered. A crystal flute trembled in someone's hand. Lady Ferncroft herself straightened as though greeting royalty. Margaret felt her heartbeat hammer painfully, but she could not move, not out of daring but out of disbelief. "Miss Ellington," he said, offering his arm with deliberate clarity, "would you permit me to escort you inside?" The shock rippled outward. No woman had been more openly dismissed by society than she. No man more openly desired than he. The contrast was almost violent. Margaret hesitated, instinct urging her to retreat, to spare him the scandal that would surely follow. But the Duke's expression held steady patience, an anchor in the shifting tides. With a breath that felt entirely too fragile, she placed her hand upon his arm. Gasps erupted behind her like a sudden wind. They entered the ballroom together, and a space seemed to part before them, equal measures awe and disbelief sculpting the crowd's silence. He did not ask her to dance. Such a gesture would ignite a full social firestorm, but the very act of walking beside her was already enough to send ripples across the ton's fragile world. They spoke quietly as they moved, though she retained little of the conversation. Her senses were overwhelmed by the enormity of what his gesture implied. A token arrived the next morning, a pamphlet tied with a ribbon in the Duke's colors, delivered discreetly but noticed nonetheless. Margaret held it with trembling fingers, uncertain whether to feel honored or terrified. It was a gift meant not for society's eyes but for hers. And yet society had already begun sharpening its claws, interpreting the exchange as strategy, desperation, manipulation. By late afternoon, word reached the Duke's household that Margaret had become the subject of ridicule once more, this time laced with venom, as though the mere hint of his interest had turned admiration into hostility. That evening, as Margaret tried to compose herself in her modest sitting room, the soft clatter of hooves echoed outside. She moved to the window and froze. The Duke of Harrowden stood at her gate. He looked upward, toward her window, toward her, his expression unreadable in the soft lantern glow. The world seemed to still, as though awaiting her next breath. And in that quiet, Margaret realized something unthinkable. The rumors were no longer merely words. They were becoming consequences. Rain swept across London that afternoon with a melancholy persistence, turning the cobblestones into glistening ribbons that reflected the dull silver of the sky. Margaret sat in her small drawing-room, hands folded tightly in her lap as the fire crackled with gentle insistence. She knew why the Duke had come the night before, though he had spoken no words. His presence alone had been a declaration she could neither ignore nor accept without trembling. Yet she had not gone to the window to greet him. Fear had pinned her in place, fear intertwined with longing so profound it felt almost dangerous. She had spent her entire adult life shielding herself from hope. To welcome it now felt like stepping into a storm without a lantern. A knock interrupted her thoughts, the soft, deliberate knock of someone who expected to be admitted. Before she could rise, her housekeeper entered, cheeks flushed from surprise. "Miss Ellington, His Grace is here. He requests but a moment of your time." Margaret's breath vanished. For a moment she considered refusing, sending him away for his own good. But propriety, courtesy, and something far more fragile urged her to her feet. When she entered the narrow hall, he stood with his hat held respectfully, raindrops darkening the shoulders of his coat, his expression solemn yet gentle. "Miss Ellington," he said, bowing, "forgive the intrusion. I come only to ask whether you would honor me with a brief conversation. Matters of concern have reached me, and I wish to set them right." The storm outside seemed to retreat under the force of his voice. She nodded and led him to the drawing-room, where the fire cast warm light upon the walls. He removed his gloves slowly, carefully, as though mindful of the intimacy of the gesture. When he faced her again, Margaret saw something unguarded in his eyes, a sincerity that unsettled her more than any charm could have done. "I fear," he began, "that my actions of late have brought you discomfort. I meant only to show respect where respect was due, but society has taken liberties with its interpretations." "Society always does," Margaret replied softly, though she did not meet his gaze. "I assure you, Your Grace, I will manage. I have grown familiar with the ton's creative imagination." He stepped closer, just enough to draw her eyes back to his. "That is precisely what troubles me. You should not be forced to endure cruelty for a fault that is not yours." "Fault?" She let out a breath that trembled. "Your Grace, they do not see my age as circumstance. They see it as failure." His jaw tightened. "Then they are fools." The simplicity of the statement nearly undid her. She turned toward the fire, her reflection wavering in the polished brass. "You misunderstand," she whispered. "The whispers may wound me, but they will wound you more. Your reputation carries weight. Mine carries none. If society believes I am attempting to secure your favor, it is because no one can imagine a duke seeking mine." The silence that followed was not empty, it was thick with things unsaid. He moved to stand beside her, close enough that the warmth of his presence rivaled the fire's glow. "Miss Ellington," he said quietly, "do you believe I offer my company out of pity?" She closed her eyes. The truth was too dangerous. "I do not presume to know your intentions." "Then allow me to make them plain." His voice lowered, each word deliberate. "I seek your company because your mind is clear, your heart sincere, and your presence, whether in a crowded ballroom or a modest drawing room, brings a calm I have not known in years. I have returned to a society obsessed with superficial charms, yet the moment you spoke yesterday the entire world narrowed to your voice." Her heart struck against her ribs. She tried to speak, but no sound followed. He continued, softer still. "You asked me once indirectly why I looked at you at the ball. I answer you now because you stood alone and yet you did not falter. Because you have learned grace without applause. Because you are not merely seen, you are felt." Margaret's composure fractured. She steadied herself against the mantel, blinking away the sting of tears she refused to shed. "You must not say such things," she whispered. "They are too easily misunderstood." "Then allow them to be understood correctly," he said. "By you." He reached out, not to take her hand, but to rest his fingertips near hers on the mantel, close enough that she felt the warmth but not the touch. The restraint in that gesture felt more intimate than any embrace. "I do not seek society's approval," he murmured. "I seek what is genuine. And if that means scandal, then scandal must come." Margaret turned toward him fully, breath uneven. "Your Grace. Thomas, you risk too much. A duke does not pursue a woman like me without consequence." He met her gaze without flinching. "Perhaps consequence is the price of truth." Those words struck her like a bolt of light, illuminating, frightening, impossible to forget. She saw in him not a nobleman indulging in temporary fascination, but a man who had spent years negotiating treaties without ever learning to negotiate his own heart. His sincerity was overwhelming. It demanded an answer she did not know how to give. Before she could gather the courage to speak, a sharp knock broke the moment. Her housekeeper rushed in, breathless and pale. "Miss Ellington, pardon me, but a messenger has arrived with urgent news." Margaret accepted the sealed note and unfolded it with trembling hands. As her eyes skimmed the ink, a chill swept through her. The Ton had birthed a new rumor, one far more venomous than the rest. It claimed she intended to manipulate the Duke into a proposal. It claimed she had invited him to her home for that purpose. It claimed she sought to ensnare him through calculated desperation. Her hand shook violently. The Duke waited, face taut with concern. "What is it?" he asked. She forced the words out, barely above a whisper. "They say, I plan to trap you into marriage." The silence that followed was colder than the storm outside. And in that stillness, Margaret realized the truth behind her fear. This was no longer simply rumor. This was war. The rumor spread through London with the precision of a sharpened blade, each whisper slicing deeper into Margaret's already fragile composure. By morning, every drawing room from Mayfair to Belgravia carried some distorted version of the same cruel tale. Miss Ellington, the spinster of 40, had finally revealed her true nature. Ambition cloaked in humility, desperation masked as dignity. They said she engineered the Duke's visits. They said she feigned virtue to lure him. They said she intended to force his hand in the only way a woman of her age could, through scandal. Margaret read each accusation in the tremor of her maid's voice, heard them in the too careful tones of passing acquaintances, saw them in the pitying glances of strangers. By afternoon, her shame had calcified into a single certainty: her presence in the Duke's life would destroy him. So she withdrew. For 3 days she remained inside her home, curtains drawn, declining every invitation, ignoring every inquiry. Letters from friends accumulated unanswered, and one from the Duke, bearing only a single line asking to speak with her, lay unopened on her desk, its seal unbroken like a fragile promise she feared to touch. She convinced herself it was better this way. Better to be thought a coward than to ruin a man who had shown her nothing but respect. Better to smother her heart's fragile hope before it ignited a fire neither could escape. But Thomas Blackwood was not a man accustomed to being shut out. On the 4th evening, as rain softened into mist over the quiet street, a firm knock echoed through her house. Margaret, standing by the window, froze. It was too late for ordinary callers, too intentional for chance. Her housekeeper appeared moments later, face pale with the tension of someone bearing news too heavy to soften. "Miss Ellington. His Grace insists he will not leave without seeing you." Margaret felt her breath shatter. Every instinct screamed to run, to hide, to protect him from the ruin her reputation had become. But running would only confirm the lies. And hiding from truth was something she had grown too weary to continue. She walked to the drawing room, her steps slow but steady. When she entered, the Duke stood at the center of the room, rain-damp hair darkened, his expression carved from furious resolve and wounded concern. He bowed, though his eyes did not leave hers. "Margaret," he said, her name spoken without title, without pretense, a plea disguised as a greeting. "What have they done to you?" She lifted her chin, summoning the composure that had carried her through 2 decades of silent endurance. "It is not what they have done to me, Your Grace. It is what they will do to you. The rumors grow worse each hour. If I continue to see you, your reputation—" "My reputation?" he cut in sharply. "Is that truly what you believe I fear?" "I know it is what I must fear," she replied, voice trembling. "I cannot allow myself to be the instrument of your undoing." His expression softened, not with resignation but with sorrow. He approached her slowly, hands clasped behind him as though restraining the impulse to take hers. "Margaret, listen to me. What harms me is not society's games. What harms me is your absence. When you vanished these past days, the world felt diminished." The confession struck her harder than any insult the tongue had whispered. She turned away, moving toward the fireplace, hiding her tears in the flicker of the flames. "Please," she whispered, "do not speak so. They already believe I seek your affection with calculated purpose." "Then let them believe what they wish," he replied, voice deepening. "I refuse to arrange my life according to the fears of small-minded people." "You cannot simply dismiss them," she said, turning back toward him. "They hold power, influence. They shape the very world you must navigate." "And what of the world you must navigate?" he countered. "What of the slander you endure while I remain untouched? Do you think I find this tolerable?" Margaret swallowed hard. "I think you underestimate the cost." He stepped closer, close enough that she felt the warmth of him even through the widening distance she tried to maintain. "I am fully aware of the cost," he said softly, "and I will pay it willingly if it means you no longer stand alone." For a moment neither spoke. The rain whispered against the window, a gentle, persistent witness to their unraveling restraint. Then, gathering courage from a place she had long buried, Margaret asked the question that trembled in her soul. "Why me? With all the young, beautiful women London throws at your feet, why choose ruin for someone like me?" The Duke exhaled, a sound shaped by both tenderness and frustration. "Because none of them see the world as you do. None speak with your conviction, your gentleness, your unshakable dignity. None silence a room with a single quiet truth. None challenge me simply by existing, and none," he added, his voice falling to a near whisper, "make me wish for a life of peace more than you do." Her breath caught, her world tilted. She felt the borders of her resolve waver as though they had been drawn in water, not stone. But before she could respond, he straightened, expression shifting from vulnerable to resolute. "I will not retreat from this. Not from you. If society wishes for spectacle, then I shall provide one they will not forget." Fear jolted through her. "Thomas, what do you intend?" "Something bold," he said, his eyes warming with quiet fire. "Something undeniable." The following evening, London's elite gathered for the spring assembly, A night designed to display beauty, wealth, and influence in lavish choreography. Margaret attended only because her absence would have fueled new scandal. She entered quietly, hoping to blend into the margins as she always had. But the room fell still the moment the Duke entered. He walked through the crowd not with arrogance, but with absolute certainty, his gaze locked onto hers across the glittering expanse. Music paused, conversation stilled, and Margaret's heartbeat thundered in her ears. He approached her, not hesitantly, not discreetly, but with deliberate purpose. And in full view of the astonished ton, he bowed and offered his hand. "Miss Ellington," he said, voice carrying through the silent ballroom, "may I have the honor of the first dance?" Gasps erupted like sparks. And Margaret realized, too late to stop it, what boldness truly meant. The breathless hush that swept across the spring assembly felt like the tightening of 1,000 silk ribbons, delicate, suffocating, and irreversible. Margaret stood motionless before the Duke, her gloved hands suspended between refusal and surrender, her pulse thundering louder than the violins poised in shocked silence. Never in her 40 years had she imagined herself in the center of a ballroom's gaze, nor had she ever wished to be. Yet here she stood, facing the most desired man in London, as expectation crackled around them like a storm about to break. The Duke waited, steady, unflinching, with his hand extended, offering not a dance but a declaration. "Your Grace," she whispered, "you must reconsider. The consequences belong to me," he interrupted softly, though his voice carried to the furthest gilded balcony. "If society wishes to craft a tale about us, let the tale be truth." No man had ever spoken for her with such fearless sincerity. No one had risked their place for her dignity. Her heart swelled painfully, caught between longing and dread. Slowly, almost unwillingly, she placed her hand into his. The moment their palms met, the room gasped again, as though witnessing an impropriety rather than an act of courage. The Duke lifted her hand with gentle reverence and led her onto the dance floor, the crowd parting like a tide pulled by an unseen moon. The musicians, startled but obedient, lifted their bows. The first notes drifted into the air, soft, hesitant, then blooming into melody. Thomas moved with poised assurance, guiding her in the opening steps of the waltz. Margaret followed, though her breath caught with every turn, her senses overwhelmed by the enormity of what they enacted. She felt the heat of his hand at her back, the strength of his frame, the steadiness of his gaze that held only her, as though no others existed. It was a dance meant for royalty, for celebrated beauties, not for a woman the world had labeled forgotten. Whispers swelled around them, but they became distant, muffled, irrelevant. For the first time, Margaret felt the weight of society slide from her shoulders, replaced by something far more terrifying, hope. The Duke leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "Do not shrink from this moment," he murmured. "You deserve to be seen." Her voice trembled. "But I do not desire spectacle." "Then let this be memory," he replied. "One that belongs to us." The dance continued, graceful and defiant, until the final note faded into stunned silence. When the Duke released her hand, he bowed with profound respect. The gesture so intimate it stole the room's breath a third time. And then he spoke, his voice firm enough to etch itself into the evening's history. "I claim no favor tonight but Miss Ellington's." The scandal was immediate. A ripple of shock, disbelief, and indignation swept through the assembly. Mothers clutched daughters as though shielding them from her influence. Gentlemen exchanged sharp, speculative glances. But Margaret felt none of it. Her world had narrowed to the pounding of her heart and the dawning understanding that the Duke had done something irrevocable. He had chosen her. That realization filled her with equal parts joy and terror. She stepped back, lifting her chin with quiet dignity. "Your Grace, you have forced their hand and mine. Do you understand what you have done?" He studied her, eyes steady, unyielding. "I understand exactly." She swallowed, unable to form the words tangled in her throat. Before she could gather them, Lady Haraway approached in a flurry of silk and disapproval. "Your Grace," she said sharply, "surely this display was misinterpreted. You cannot intend." "I intended everything," he replied without shifting his gaze from Margaret. Lady Haraway faltered, retreating in confusion. Margaret's breath wavered. She felt the walls of the ballroom closing in, suffocating with judgment. Though the Duke stood strong beside her, she knew she could not remain beneath such scrutiny. She needed air. She needed clarity. She excused herself with trembling composure and slipped toward the terrace, the cool night welcoming her like an old friend. Outside, lanterns flickered against the mist. Margaret pressed her palms to the railing, gripping the chilled iron as though it could steady the chaos within her. A dance, a declaration, a public choice. How could one evening alter the shape of her entire life? She closed her eyes, letting the night air cool her flushed skin. But footsteps approached behind her, familiar and purposeful. She did not turn as Thomas stepped beside her. "You ran," he said softly. She exhaled shakily. "I walked. Rapidly." A faint smile touched his lips. "May I ask what frightened you?" "Everything," she whispered. "Your boldness, their stares. The future that now feels impossible." "It feels inevitable to me," he murmured. The honesty in his voice made her chest tighten. She turned toward him, her eyes shimmering in the lantern glow. "Thomas, your world is filled with power and promise. Mine is modest, ordinary. I will bring you no alliances, no fortune, no social triumphs." "Fortune and triumph bore me," he replied. "But you, your mind, your kindness, your strength, those I desire more fiercely than society's approval." She shook her head, tears gathering. "You think you know what you desire. But you have not yet faced what society will do to you if you bind yourself to someone like me." He stepped closer, his voice lowering with conviction. "Then let them come. I have weathered storms far greater than gossip." "Storms?" she whispered. "Do not whisper your ruin." He reached for her hand and closing it gently. "Margaret, if you believe I offer affection lightly, you misjudge me entirely." Her breath trembled. "What is it you offer?" He held her gaze, the world falling away around them. "A lifetime," he said. She froze, her heart roaring in her ears. For a moment she thought she must have misheard. But his eyes held no jest, no hesitation. Only truth. "A lifetime?" she repeated. "Yes," he answered. "If you will have it." The world stilled. The lanterns flickered. Somewhere inside, music resumed, but it seemed miles away. Margaret opened her mouth, but no words came. Emotion surged too powerfully, too swiftly. Thomas lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a reverent kiss against her glove. "I will return tomorrow," he said quietly. "Not for society. For you." He stepped back, giving her space, granting her the dignity of choice. And then he walked away, leaving her breathless in the cold, trembling with the weight of a future she had never dared imagine. As the terrace door closed behind him, Margaret pressed a hand to her heart, stunned, shaken, and irrevocably changed. For the first time she understood that the world would not decide her fate. She would